So today, folks, we have a very special treat. We have a foreign correspondent, Dimitri SImes. How are you doing?
I'm doing just fine. How are you, Alex?
Well, I am not sweltering in the Russian heat. For those of you who do, instead I'm sweltering in the DC heat. For those who do not know, Dimitri is off in Moscow currently right now. And if I'm to understand correctly, you're pursuing your career as a journalist in Russia, right?
Well, I'm currently in Moscow at the moment, trying to cover some big issues in the US-Russian relationship and Russian foreign policy as a whole.
So I definitely want to get to that. And if we have enough time within this segment, that's great. But I want to talk right now into some things that the average American may not be aware is going on in the mind of the average Russian, specifically the culture. How exactly is the political understanding of your average Russian person different from the average American? The average American, there's there's a big difference between conservative and liberal, but is that mindset similar in Russia? You say there's two groups with, a very individualistic standard or a very liberal, open-hearted kind of mindset? Would you say that exists?
Well, I would say that, first of all, the sort of political spectrum in Russia is very different because, historically, at least for the past 50 years in the United States, there's been a Republican Party, which is fiscally conservative on the individualistic side, strong national defense and traditional values. And then there's, a left-wing liberal party, which is more individualistic on social issues, but wants a more sort of expansive government to deal with the economy. In Russia, it's a bit different because of the fact that conservatives historically were never associated with classical liberalism or individualism. So what you see in Russia, there's greater political fragmentation. You're starting to see some emergence of sort of libertarian groups in Russia.
Really?
Yeah, there's actually one very prominent Twitter personality called Mikhail Svedov. He really is a sort of an extravagant character. But yeah, there are now libertarians in Russia, believe it or not. But for the most part, I would say that Russians are far less inclined to the sort of individualistic and market economy mindset that dominates the American political spectrum. I would say as a whole, Russians are far more accepting of the idea that the government should play a significant role in the economy, or at least, some role in the economy. And that's something that I see both, from traditional conservatives in Russia. I see that from people on the left. I see even some people who are otherwise classically liberal, but just because of the fact that government having some role in the economy is accepted, that's just more or less the political norm in Russia.
I heard a while ago, I can't remember from who or where or when it was, somebody made the statement that Russians don't deserve American democracy or American freedoms because they don't understand democracy the same way we do. This is some American author. What do you think that the Russian mind, the Russian culture, could take on some sort of American government, or is that just way too much of a culture shock, too much difference?
Well, as a whole, my inclination is that I'm not of the opinion that there's a one-size-fits-all model to government. I think that different countries and different circumstances require different governments. Whether Russians are culturally inclined to democracy or not is something that's pretty hotly debated, because if you go all the way back to Russian history, like the very earliest days, you can see some sort of small Russian city-state democracies in places like Novgorod, for example. But you are right that historically Russia has had some sort of form of autocratic government or semi-autocratic government.
Yeah.
So to kind of snap our fingers and expect Russia to become a Jeffersonian democracy overnight and to do so fluidly, seamlessly, without any sort of problems or upheavals is probably over-optimistic. What I am seeing, Bo, is that there are, in certain cases in Russia, developing local democracies. For example, there's communities that increasingly are voting on how to deal with local issues like where do we build the playground? How do we allocate the funds necessary for the playground? These sort of local everyday issues. There are some signs that there's growing democracy in that area.
Okay. Just a very broad question. Do you think that Russians prefer more autocracy or more democracy, meaning more involvement in their government as a people, or they prefer the government more involved in them?
What I would say is that when it comes to individual freedom and sort of, the size and scope of government, I would say it's a secondary issue for most Russians more than economic security and national security. I think that from what I can see, most people on the Russian political spectrum, if the government does a decent enough job of providing for their basic needs, having some sort of perceived level of economic fairness, and there's also a sense that Russia is a major player on the world stage, they're more willing to tolerate the government, restricting some individual freedoms or some political freedoms if they have these sort of economics, security, and this sort of sense of national security and national pride.
Okay, so you're saying that, would you say that national pride means more to the Russians than it does to the average U.S. citizen? Patriotism, or?
I mean, I do think it is a little bit, there's a different context, right? Because if you think of the United States as a country surrounded by two oceans, and the reason that's significant is because it makes it very difficult for the United States to be attacked. So other than the War of 1812, we really haven't faced, a major invasion. Russia in history, to put it delicately, is very different. You can go all the way back to the Mongols in the Middle Ages, where they, pretty much kept Russia under control for, I believe it's 300 years, or, subjected large portions of Russia. You have the cases of Napoleon, Poland, Sweden, most recently Nazi Germany.
Even Sweden, yeah, that's a point people forget, is Sweden was a pretty big threat to Russia. That you're absolutely right, yeah.
Yeah, so the fact that, Russia has a history of facing invasions, particularly Western invasions, it makes them more anxious. I think it causes people in Moscow to be more anxious about Russian national security than people in Washington, simply because there's a greater historical memory of getting invaded.
Right. You're right. It is very different because I personally know people who have been banned or shouted down for saying the Pledge of Allegiance at public meetings. But then over in Russia, it seems like the government is encouraging this sort of patriotism and love of their country. And the Russians I've met who are, grew up in Russia, live in Russia their whole lives, completely bewildered that anyone would doubt the wonderfulness of Russia. Right? Is that fair? Or?
But to be fair, as you said, the government encourages patriotism, and part of the way it does that is it tries to tie itself into patriotism. I think that to say that, part of, being a patriotic Russian is supporting the Russian state. And I think, there are good intentioned patriotic Russians who can say that, we love our country, but we don't necessarily like what the government is doing, either in economics or in foreign policy.
Sure.
So I would say that definitely the Kremlin's, efforts to portray, to construct a national unity narrative.
Oh, your internet's kind of. Oh, you just got.
Serving as a whole.
Okay.
Am I good?
Yeah, you're fine. You're fine. Just a little snafu there. I want to ask.
Another thing I want to add is that although Russia, like the United States, is a multicultural country, I think that the fact that the United States is a nation of immigrants sort of kind of people have a sense that they have roots in the United States, but they also have roots elsewhere. Whereas Russia is a multicultural country, but it's a multicultural empire. So there's a sense that there's a greater sense of a Russian people. In fact, I was talking the other day with someone who pointed out that there's a term for the Russian people called narod, which means the term narod has a cultural and ethnic connotation, like a group of people with a common culture and a common heritage. There really isn't a sort of equivalent term in English for that. So that's kind of an illustration of how uh, Russia perhaps puts a greater emphasis on cultural and ethnic ties than we do in the United States.
Interesting.
Or at least historically.
We talked. I mean, it's the 4th of July, so everyone is asking themselves, what does it mean to be an American? And they give their thoughts. And I recently made a podcast on that, what I think it is. But what do you think the average Russian says to themselves when they are asked, what does it mean to be a Russian?
Well, I think it's a little bit different because the fact of the matter is the United States was built on the sort of philosophical idea. It was built on the ideals of the Enlightenment. It was built on the sort of rejection of old European conservatism and a sort of saying, we're adopting the ideas of John Locke, Jean-Jacques Rousseau, and we're going to try and implement these ideas in the United States of individual freedom on one hand, also equal opportunity. I think as much of an when it comes to Russian identity, but I will say that just a sort of set along culture. And so people may say that Orthodox Christianity, a big role. But I won't say it's just.
You're kind of popping in and
Russian.
You're kind of popping in and out. Just so we're clear here, to be a Russian means to adhere to the Orthodox Christian faith as a major one, correct?
A lot of people would say. I don't think that's like a hard and fast rule. There are definitely some people who say that Orthodox faith is important. I think if you ask most people, they would say just like loving, feeling connected to Russian history and Russian culture.
Okay, interesting. So that is good to know. One more question about the Russian culture, and that is, what is up with this Putin phenomenon? These teens who have grown up only knowing Putin as their leader, and they have a staunch...
Well, it's very interesting.
Well, yeah, go ahead.
Well, I actually was also in Moscow. Positive will have a generally favorable view of Putin, primarily because they believe that for him the country has experienced significant socioeconomic development. They're very scared of the government and the Russian system. Look at their perception of compared to the rest of the Russian government. There's a huge gap. I think young Russians are very cognizant of the fact that there's a lot of problems in the country, such as corruption, socioeconomic equality, a host of. They're not blind to their country's problems. And in my, I've been really surprised by position policy. They really don't view these sort of issues for short way of putting, not call them Putin, not Putin boys, Putin girls. who. So, to reform.
I think you're breaking up a little bit too much. I think we got the pretty general idea for this segment, so I think I'll end the
Hello?
podcast. Yeah, I'm here. Do you hear me? You hear me? All right. I think that this is a good place to end the podcast for now. I'll hit the re-record button and see if we can establish better connection for the next segment. Thanks a lot for listening, folks. Don't forget to like, subscribe, share, and I'll catch you really soon, Dimitri. Thank you so much for coming on.